Thank you for coming back. As you'll note in our title, in this section, we're going to be looking at different types of aircraft. And as we mentioned previously, we want to take a much more visual approach to our analysis. Let's see what we mean. Let's kick things off by saying that within each segment of the U.S. air import market, multiple aircraft types are in use. And we're talking different types of passenger aircraft, as well as potentially different types of cargo aircraft. Second bullet, and we've mentioned a couple of these before, but there's some new variables in the equation. The type of aircraft deployed in a given market depends on several dynamics. Trade flows, volumes of cargo, we have already mentioned. Passenger travel patterns we mentioned as well. Another is the distance between airport pairs, meaning how far is it from Singapore Airport to Dallas-Fort Worth in Texas. That matters from a range perspective, which we'll talk more about in just a bit. Another that people sometimes don't think about is the capacity of the airport itself, and not so much the physical plant. Does it have warehouses and coolers and such? We're talking about the length of the runway. Certain aircraft are just so big that they need a specific amount of minimum foot of runway in order to be able to land and take off there. The airlines and the airports clearly worry about that and take care of those things. We as importers, at least through our freight forwarders, should know about the restrictions and or capabilities of the airports that we like to use as importers. Another factor as it relates to type of aircraft deployed in a given market is one that people also might not think about: airport altitude and weather conditions. The higher up in altitude, the more restrictions are placed on aircraft. So it's not just the length of the runway and the size of the aircraft, it's the altitude of the airport itself. Weather as well. Think about Denver in the United States. Pretty high up and not always the best weather. There are other places too. In the Western Hemisphere, one could think of Bogota, 3,000 meters above sea level, close to 10,000 feet above sea level. A little bit rainy from time to time, can be a tricky airport to operate in and out of. Another consideration is the time of year. And not just weather-wise time of year, but seasonality. We talked about Miami being a hub for fresh-cut flowers. One can imagine that leading up to holidays like Mother's Day or Valentine's Day, that things might get a little busy in Miami from a fresh-cut flower perspective. As importers, again, at least through our freight forwarders, we need to be aware of these things. And then, of course, another determining factor is just good old competition. Is a market saturated? Can it take on another flight? Competition is an important factor. Another important factor, as we see in our last bullet, is that every aircraft has physical restrictions. Weight and space capacity. This should ring a bell right away, because we talked about this on ocean freight, that ships have weight and space capacity, ocean containers have weight and space capacity, and aircraft definitely have weight and space capacity. This will come up again. But another restriction we mentioned briefly is the range. How far can an aircraft fly? Up until 15 or so years ago, aircraft couldn't make a nonstop flight from, say, a Hong Kong all the way to DFW. Ranges of aircraft have increased, making DFW a much more viable airport to work in and out of. So once again, range is a big deal. Let's start to look at some of these aircraft, and we'll see them from the outside and the inside coming up in just a few minutes. But let's start off with passenger aircraft. We're going to have a look at the Boeing 777-300ER. Needless to say, an image to our right. This is a passenger aircraft where cargo, along with a bunch of other stuff, including luggage and mail, etc., goes below deck, as it's called. We can see on the left-hand side cargo door dimension. Now, as an importer, it might seem like that shouldn't be something that we need to worry about. Actually, it is. And the most important number, whether we're an airline, a freight forwarder, or an importer, that we should be thinking about is the height capacity of the door to get cargo into the belly of an aircraft, and that is 64 inches. When we think about passenger aircraft, be thinking about 64 inches. There are other numbers that are important. This is a height restriction, and we can see it on the forward door. The cargo door dimensions, 64 by 106. The aft door, that's the rear door, also 64 inches. And then there's a bulk door, even a smaller door, that only has a 45-inch height capacity. If we are importing cargo that happens to be tall, we have to be aware of that because our freight will only be able to go on cargo airlines if it exceeds 64 inches in height. That's the key factor here. On the right-hand side, we see things like maximum bulk piece weight, but this is for containerized cargo and what is called a unit loading device, maximum of 10,000 pounds there. And individual pieces, this is also important to us as importers and freight forwarders too, because an individual piece can't exceed 350 pounds. These are important numbers that the airlines and forwarders are, at least should be very aware of, but the importers should be too, depending on the nature of their cargo. Something important to bring up as it relates to height restrictions, but also length and width restrictions, is that somebody somewhere, the carrier, forwarder, and the importer, preferably, has to know what the restrictions are on specific aircraft. What we're looking at here is called a size chart, and these are restrictions by dimensions of the cargo specific to a 777-300ER. And really what we're looking at here, and we have an example to illustrate in just a moment, but basically we look at the width in inches on the top, the height on the left-hand side, and wherever the width and the height of a piece intersect, that's the maximum amount of length that we can have. So very quickly, before we go over our example, let's pick one randomly. 15 inches wide, a piece of cargo that is 15 inches wide and 20 inches high, the maximum length is going to be 169 inches. That's how this works. Again, at the risk of sounding like a broken record, the airlines and the forwarders are supposed to know this stuff. As importers, it wouldn't be a bad idea that either A, we know about it ourselves, or B, we work with forwarders that know about it. Let's move on for a quick example, which is entitled Air Freight for Oil Field Drilling Equipment. You are the air import manager for a forwarder in Houston. You receive a request for a last-minute urgent shipment for an oversized piece of oil field drilling equipment coming in from Saudi Arabia with the dimensions of a length at 120 inches, width at 25, and the height of 16. Clearly, this is a longer piece that isn't too wide or too high. What we find out is that there is no space on any all-cargo freighters for the next 3 days coming out of Saudi into Houston, so the only option is a passenger aircraft flight on a 777-300ER. Based on the below size chart and the DIMs that we provided, will the cargo fit into the aircraft? Well, if we see here, the intersection of a width of 25 inches and a height of 16 shows a maximum length of 150 inches. So this cargo will fit into the 777-300ER because the length of our piece is 120 inches. Clearly, this is important stuff to know about. Let's look at another passenger aircraft, this time the Airbus 330-300-200. Once again, for our forward and aft door as it relates to cargo door dimension, the magic number is 64 inches. It can't be higher than 64 inches. It just won't fit. There's a bulk door, which is actually a little smaller than what we saw in the 777 because the bulk door is 24 with a height of 37. As we've noted, a little bit different configuration. Something similar, bulk pieces to that 777, 10,000 pounds to be built into containers, 350 pounds for shipments to be bulk loaded. Pretty similar aircraft, but a little bit different. Let's look at some dimensional restrictions for cargo on the Airbus 330. Looking at a size chart for a forward compartment. As we see, the height goes from 0 to 22 on the left-hand side. The width goes from 4 to 40 on the right-hand side. Where the width and the height intersect based on the dimensions of a specific piece, that's going to be the length restriction. So if we pick one more extreme, 22 inches in height, 40 inches wide, the length restriction is going to be 100 inches. Let's look at a real-world example that helps bring this story to life. In this real-world example, we're talking about air freight for meat processing equipment. You are the air import manager for a forwarder in Chicago, Illinois. Your top client, an importer of German meat processing equipment, has a line-down situation at a plant in Indiana. So it sounds like this importer sells to meat processing plants, and one of their customers has a line down. The next flight out of Stuttgart, which of course is in Germany, is on an Airbus 330 aircraft, but the dimensions of the replacement part are pretty big. 105 inches long, 28 inches wide, and 20 inches high. Based on the below size chart for the Airbus 330, will the cargo fit on the aircraft? Or better yet, will the cargo fit into the forward compartment? Let's have a look. The intersection of width of 28 inches and a height of 20 inches shows a maximum length of 100 inches. We just saw that in our random example, actually. So this cargo will not fit on this aircraft, or at the very least, will not fit in the forward compartment, and let's hope that there's room in the main belly of the aircraft. Obviously, the point of these last two real-world examples is to illustrate that we as importers have to work with freight forwarders and airlines that are cognizant of these restrictions. Otherwise, we might find our air freight not moving very quickly. We're going to wrap up here, and when we come back for our next section, we're going to be looking at all cargo aircraft, starting off with the Boeing 747-8F. Some pretty cool pictures and some fun stuff to talk about.